Nobody expected that when the paramedic pressed his stethoscope to my chest and his face went still, he would look up at the other EMT and say we needed to move right now. But that Saturday in June, while my brother stood at the altar in his tuxedo and I sat crumpled against the wall of the bridal suite hallway, the whole day collapsed into something no one in my family could explain away. My stepmother had told me to stop ruining everything. My father had said, with the same tired disappointment he had worn my entire life, that I always found a way to make things about myself. Nobody expected the paramedic to disagree with both of them so completely. Let me know in the comments where you are watching from, and if any part of this story sounds familiar to you, please hit that like button and subscribe, because what happened that day changed everything. Growing up in a Callaway house meant learning very early that some people's feelings filled the room, and others were expected to take up as little space as possible. My father, Robert Callaway, was a broad-shouldered, quietly confident man who ran a logistics company out of Columbus, Ohio, and believed that discipline was the highest form of love. My mother died when I was 6. I do not remember much about her except the particular way she smelled like lavender and coffee, and the fact that she used to sit on the edge of my bed when I was sick and hold my hand without saying anything at all. After she died, my father remarried within 3 years. Her name was Linda, and she came with sharp instincts for social presentation and a deeply held belief that emotional expression was a form of weakness best corrected in children before it took root. She was not cruel in any obvious way. She never raised her voice. She simply had a talent for making you feel that whatever you were feeling was slightly embarrassing, slightly excessive, and best kept to yourself. My brother Daniel was 4 years older than me and had inherited my father's pragmatism in a way that let him move through the world without friction. He never cried at movies. He never got homesick. He absorbed Linda's presence the way certain plants absorb drought, without complaint and without apparent damage. I was not like that. I felt everything too loudly, according to them. When I was 8 and got a bad stomach virus, Linda stood in the doorway of the bathroom and watched me be sick and said very calmly that I needed to stop catastrophizing. When I was 11 and twisted my ankle badly enough that my foot swelled purple, my father looked at it and said I would be fine to walk on by morning. By the following week, when the bruising had spread and a school nurse finally called the house, it turned out I had a small fracture. My father took me to the orthopedist without apology or acknowledgement that anything had gone wrong. Linda suggested I should try to develop a higher pain threshold. The message, delivered in 1,000 small moments over a dozen years, was this: your body's signals are not trustworthy. You are too sensitive to be taken seriously. Toughen up or be quiet. By the time I left for college at Ohio State, I had internalized that message so completely I sometimes could not tell the difference between real pain and my own perceived dramatization of it. I second-guessed fevers. I talked myself out of going to urgent care. I apologized for mentioning headaches. My roommate freshman year, a girl named Natalie from Cincinnati, watched me gut through a sinus infection for 2 weeks before physically walking me to the campus health center and standing at the desk until someone took my temperature. When the reading came back at 102.4, Natalie turned to me with the expression of someone who had just won an argument she never wanted to have. For 4 years, Natalie operated as the external monitor for a body I had been taught not to trust. She learned to read the particular tightening around my eyes when I was in pain and covering it, and she refused to accept the automatic fine I deployed the way other people deploy a reflex. She became the first person in my adult life who simply believed me without requiring me to prove it first. After graduation, I moved to Chicago and found work in healthcare administration, which I recognized even at the time as a form of irony. I spent my days surrounded by people who took symptoms seriously, who documented patient concerns with careful attention, who understood that dismissing pain was not a virtue but a failure of care. I called my father on birthdays and major holidays. I visited Columbus twice a year. I kept those visits short and arranged with Natalie in advance to have an excuse ready if I needed to leave early. It was not a perfect solution, but it was a functional one. Then Daniel announced his engagement to a woman named Sophie, and everything got more complicated in the way that only a wedding can make things complicated. Sophie was warm and genuine in a way that made it impossible not to like her. She had grown up in a large Greek family in Pittsburgh and approached every gathering with the instinct that more people and more food were always an improvement. She wanted a big wedding. She wanted Daniel's whole family there, which meant me, which meant a full weekend in Columbus staying in the house I had spent years carefully managing my distance from. I agreed, of course. He was my brother. I loved him in the uncomplicated way that survives even difficult families. I said yes to being a bridesmaid. I said yes to the rehearsal dinner. I said yes to all of it, and I meant it. What I did not say yes to was the viral infection I caught about 2 weeks before the wedding. It moved through my coworkers in Chicago like a slow wave, nothing dramatic, just a week of fatigue and a low fever and the kind of chest pressure that made deep breathing slightly unpleasant. I rested over a long weekend. I drank fluids. I told Natalie I felt better by Thursday and mostly believed it. I did not go to a doctor because the symptoms had eased and because some deeply trained part of me was already preparing the internal argument against my own concern. You always think it's worse than it is. You always make it a bigger deal. I drove down to Columbus the Thursday before the Saturday wedding. The drive took nearly 3 hours, and by the time I pulled into my father's driveway, I noticed a strange fatigue settling behind my sternum, a heaviness that felt different from ordinary tiredness. I told myself it was the drive. I told myself it was the accumulated stress of wedding logistics. I carried my bags inside and smiled at Linda, who commented that I looked pale and then moved on to discussing the rehearsal dinner seating before I could respond. That night, lying in the guest room, I became aware of my own heartbeat in a way that was new and slightly unsettling. It was not racing exactly, but it was present in a way it normally was not. Like a sound in the house you could suddenly not stop noticing. I pressed my hand to my chest and lay still for a long time. Then I did what years of conditioning had trained me to do. I told myself I was tired and anxious and that I needed to sleep. The rehearsal dinner was fine. I managed it. I still remember the casual shrug as she handed me 200 Asian with her new Hubbard and I knew Hubbard Everett's family and love. Twice to sit in the bathroom for a few minutes and breathe slowly until the strange pressure in my chest eased. Nobody noticed. Natalie had made the trip down from Cincinnati and caught my eye across the table twice with a look that asked a question I deflected each time with the smallest shake of my head. On the morning of the wedding, I woke up and something was wrong. Not dramatically wrong in the way that forces immediate action. Wrong in the quiet, creeping way that is much more dangerous because it leaves room for negotiation. My chest ached with a dull, persistent pressure. Climbing the stairs to the kitchen left me winded. I sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee and told myself that the combination of stress and a lingering viral bug was simply catching up with me. That once the ceremony was over and I could stop performing cheerfulness, I would rest and recover. Linda moved through the kitchen making lists and giving directions and at one point looked at me over the rim of her reading glasses. "You are not getting sick today of all days," she said. It was not a question. I told her I was fine. The words came as automatically as breathing. The bridal suite at the venue was a large, warmly lit room that smelled of hairspray and roses and the particular collective anxiety of women who love someone who is about to get married. Sophie was radiant in the specific way of people who have prepared for something for a very long time and are finally inside the moment. Her mother kept crying and apologizing for crying. Her sisters teased her about her bouquet grip. I stood in front of the mirror in my bridesmaid dress and watched my own reflection with a kind of dissociation I could not entirely explain. My face looked normal. My color looked fine. The face looking back at me gave nothing away, and I thought, distantly, that I'd become very good at this particular form of performance. Then Natalie was beside me, not touching me, just standing close, her voice very low. "Claire, tell me right now, how are you actually feeling?" The question was so direct, and the moment was so precarious, and I was so tired of the performance that something shifted. I told her about the chest pressure. I told her about the fatigue on the stairs. I told her about waking up and knowing something was off without being able to articulate exactly what. I watched her face while I talked, and I watched to go careful and still in the way that meant she was not dismissing what I was saying. She said we should tell someone, find a medic, do something before the ceremony started. And here is where my conditioning showed its full reach. I said no. I said today was Daniel's day. I said it was probably nothing. I said I had felt almost exactly like this during finals week of junior year, and it had turned out to be nothing. I said, please, Natalie. Not today. She looked at me for a long time. She said she was watching me and she was not going to pretend she was not. I nodded and turned back to the mirror and straightened the strap of my dress and did not let myself think too carefully about any of it. The ceremony was beautiful. I still remember the casual shrug. I still remember the casual Fathe with her new 100-mate brother's face when Sophie came down the aisle, and the expression on his face was so open and unguarded that I felt a fierce, uncomplicated love for him that cut through everything else for a moment. This was real. This was worth being here for. By the reception, I was struggling. I kept it contained. I found a chair near the back of the room and sat between dances. I drank water. I smiled when people approached me and managed conversations for short periods before excusing myself. The chest pressure had shifted into something sharper, a pain that worsened when I tried to take a full breath. My heart was doing the thing again, that too present pulsing that I could feel in my throat, in my fingertips. Natalie materialized beside me during the toasts and pressed her hand briefly against the back of mine. Her fingers were warm. She looked at me with an expression that was asking the question again without words. I shook my head. Not yet. My father found me about an hour into the reception when I had retreated to a chair near the edge of the tent. He looked trim and comfortable in his suit, and he carried the particular ease of a man presiding over a successful event. He took in my seated posture and something shifted in his face. I told him I was a little tired. He said I should get up and dance, that this was Daniel's night and everyone needed to participate. I told him I would in a minute. He said I had been saying that for the last hour according to Linda. His voice had the edge I had known my whole life, the particular frequency of disappointed expectation. Then I said something I almost never said. I said I did not feel well. I said there was a pain in my chest and my heart felt strange. He looked at me the way he always looked at me when I said something like this. He looked at me like I was speaking a language he had decided not to learn. He said I had been pushing myself too hard with the drive and the rehearsal and the preparations, that it was stress and fatigue, that I needed to push through it and not let it spoil the evening. He said Daniel had worked hard to have a perfect day. He walked away. I sat with that for a minute. I sat with the familiar weight of it, the old architecture of being told my body was wrong. And then something happened that had never quite happened before in that way. I got angry. Not upset, not hurt, not the quiet crumpling I usually felt in the aftermath of being dismissed. Genuinely, clearly angry. Because I was 30 years old. Because I had a pain in my chest that was getting worse. Because I was tired of performing health I did not have for an audience that had never earned my performance. I stood up and immediately had to put my hand on the back of the chair because the room shifted. A cold sweat had broken out across my shoulders. The pain in my chest was no longer dull. It was sharp and present and radiating down my left arm in a way that some distant, clinical part of my brain recognized as significant. I made it approximately 12 feet toward the exit before my legs stopped cooperating. I did not fall dramatically. I simply folded, going down against the wall of the hallway that connected the tent to the main building. I had enough awareness to get my back against the wall rather than going fully to the floor. I remember the carpet was a deep burgundy and there was a framed landscape painting at eye level when I turned my head. I remember thinking, with the strange clarity of crisis, that I needed Natalie. I did not need to call for her. She was there inside 30 seconds, kneeling on the carpet in her bridesmaid dress, her hand on my face, asking me sharp, direct questions about where the pain was and how long and whether it went anywhere else. Behind her, I was dimly aware of other people gathering. Linda's voice arrived before the others. She said, sharp and low, that this was not the time or the place. She said I had a history of this kind of thing. She told the small crowd beginning to form that I struggled with anxiety and that I was going to be fine. Natalie looked up at her. Natalie, who was the most fundamentally polite person I knew, looked up at my stepmother with an expression I had never seen on her face before and said, with complete calm, that she needed everyone to step back and someone needed to call 911 right now. Linda said, "Do not you dare do that in the middle of my son's reception." Natalie had already pulled out her phone. Daniel found us in the hallway. His tie was slightly loosened and he had clearly been mid-conversation when someone pulled him away. He took in the scene with rapid comprehension and came straight to the floor beside me. his big hand wrapping around my shoulder, his voice steady in the way of someone who is frightened and refusing to show it. "Claire, I have got you. Look at me." I looked at him. I tried to tell him it might be nothing, but the pain was making full sentences difficult. "You are not faking this," he said, and the simplicity of it, the absence of any question in it at all, broke something open inside me that I had been holding shut for a very long time. I heard Linda in the background saying this is going to be in all the photos, saying that the ambulance lights would be visible from the tent. I heard my father's voice, uncertain now, saying her name in a way that told me even he was beginning to understand that something had moved beyond the territory of my supposed dramatics. The paramedics arrived in the specific way emergency professionals arrive, which is to say they arrived and the room rearranged itself around them. A woman and a man in uniform, both moving with the efficient purposefulness of people who had done this thousands of times. The woman knelt beside me and began talking to me in a focused, calm voice while the man opened the equipment bag. They asked me to describe the pain. They asked me to describe the pain. They asked when it started. They asked about the virus I had a few weeks ago. When I said yes, there was a virus, she and her partner exchanged a look that I filed away without fully understanding. She pressed the stethoscope to my chest, then to a different position. Then she looked at her partner and said they needed the monitor. She said it with the particular quality of professional composure that a person learns to read after years in healthcare administration as the voice someone uses when they already know something is wrong. My heart rate was high and irregular. She said the word myocarditis quietly to her partner. She said we were transporting. My father said, from somewhere behind me, that he thought this was not necessary, that she seemed to be responding to stress, that we should let her rest for a few minutes first. The paramedic looked at my father with the particular patience of someone who has no time for the conversation being proposed. She said she understood this was a difficult moment for the family. She said her job was to ensure the patient received appropriate care, and in her clinical assessment that care needed to happen in a hospital right now. Then she looked back at me and her voice shifted into the direct, person-to-person register that I would remember long afterward. She said, "You've been feeling symptoms for a while, yes?" I said yes. She said, "You waited because people told you it was nothing?" I said yes. She said, "You were right to be concerned. Your heart is telling us something important." Nobody in my life had ever said that sentence to me before. The ride to the hospital was not like the movies. It was bright and loud and disorienting, and Natalie was not allowed to come, though she promised she would be there within 20 minutes. Daniel rode with me, still in his tuxedo, holding my hand while the paramedics worked and spoke in their urgent shorthand above me. I watched the ceiling of the ambulance and concentrated on breathing slowly and thought about how strange it was to be here, in this vehicle, on this day, after all these years of learning to pretend. The diagnosis came with clinical precision from a cardiologist named Dr. 200. Osei, who had calm eyes and a directness I found immediately trustworthy. Myocarditis, he said. Inflammation of the heart muscle, most likely triggered by the viral infection from 2 weeks ago. In most cases, it resolves with rest and medication and monitoring. In some cases, particularly when it is not caught and the patient continues physical exertion, it can become dangerous. He said my inflammatory markers were elevated. He said the irregular rhythm they had caught on the monitor was the thing that concerned him most. He said I had done the right thing by coming in when I did. I almost did not come in, I told him. People told me I was overreacting. He held my gaze without flinching. That happens, he said. Particularly with women. Particularly with younger women. Your symptoms were real and they were significant and you were right to be concerned. He said it plainly, without particular drama, the way someone states a fact. But I had spent so many years being told the opposite that even a plain statement of validation felt like something I needed to hold carefully. The way you hold something fragile you are afraid to drop. Natalie arrived at the hospital 35 minutes after I did, still in her bridesmaid dress, heels abandoned somewhere and replaced with a pair of gas station flip-flops. She sat in the chair beside my bed and did not say I told you so, which she had fully earned. She just reached over and held my hand and said she was glad I was okay. Daniel arrived 20 minutes after Natalie, having handed his new wife to her parents with a brief explanation and driven directly to the hospital. Sophie came 2 hours later. still in her wedding gown, which she said she did not care about even slightly, and which made me cry for the first time that entire day. My father and Linda arrived together. My father looked like he had aged several years in the course of an evening. Linda's composure was still in place but had a quality of strain around the edges, like something expensive under pressure. They stood at the foot of my hospital bed and looked at the monitors and the IV and the cardiac leads, and I watched them process the evidence in front of them. My father cleared his throat. He said the doctor had explained things to him in the hallway. He said he was glad they had caught it. I looked at him for a moment. There was a version of this conversation where I accepted those words and let the moment pass the way I had let 1,000 moments pass, smoothing them over with the old instinct toward keeping peace. I felt that reflex clearly. And then I let it go. I told him that I tried to tell him in the tent. I told him I said there was something wrong with my chest, and he told me to push through it and not ruin Daniel's night. He shifted his weight. He said he had not realized it was serious. I know, I said. That is what I need you to understand. You never think it is serious when it comes from me. You never have? Linda said with her voice still careful and controlled. That I had a history of catastrophizing. That none of them could have been expected to know this time was different from the other times. I asked her to tell me about the other times. I asked her to give me one specific example where I catastrophized a medical situation that turned out to be nothing. The room was very quiet. She opened her mouth and closed it. My father sat down in the chair near the wall. He sat down heavily, the way a person sits when something has gone out of them. He looked at the floor. He looked at his hands. I told him about the ankle at 11. I told him about the sinus infection at 15 that had gone to my ears and required antibiotics. They delayed for 2 weeks because Linda said I was milking it. I told him about the time in senior year when I had back pain so severe I could not straighten up, and they sent me to school because they assumed I was avoiding a presentation, and the school counselor who finally took me to urgent care and found a kidney infection. I told him these things not with tears, not with the pleading quality of someone asking to be believed, but with the measured steadiness of someone recounting documented facts. Because that was what they were. Daniel, sitting beside the bed, said very quietly that he remembered most of those. He said he had not understood then what the pattern was. He said he was sorry he had not said something sooner. My father looked up from his hands. His face had an expression I could not recall seeing on it before. Not the performed sorrow of a man managing optics. Something more uncomfortable than that. Something that looked like recognition. He said, "I taught you not to trust yourself." It was not an apology exactly, but it was a true thing. And it was the first true thing he had said about our relationship in the 30 years I had been his daughter. I told him that yes, he had. Linda left the room about 10 minutes later. She said she needed air. I did not expect her to return that night, and she did not. My father stayed. He sat in the chair near the wall and stayed, not talking, not trying to fix or explain or manage, just staying. I fell asleep at some point, and when I woke at 2 in the morning, he was still there, asleep in the chair with his chin on his chest. And something about the sight of him, diminished and present and quiet, loosened something in me that I had been clenching for a very long time. I spent 3 days in the hospital. They monitored my heart rhythm, adjusted my medication, and had me walk careful laps of the cardiac ward with a telemetry pack strapped to my waist. A nurse named Dwight, who had the energy of someone who had seen everything and still found most of it interesting, explained my discharge instructions with a thoroughness I found deeply reassuring. He told me that patients frequently delayed seeking care for cardiac symptoms, that women in particular were far more likely to minimize and wait. He said telling a healthcare provider about symptoms early, even symptoms that seemed minor, was not weakness or hypochondria. It was appropriate and it was potentially life-saving. I thought about how many years I had been told exactly the opposite. Sophie visited twice. She brought me a card signed by every person who had been at the wedding, including people I had never met, Sophie's cousins and childhood friends, and a man from Pittsburgh who turned out to be her third-grade teacher. She told me she was sorry this had happened, and I told her it was not her fault, and she said that was true, but she was still sorry. And that was exactly the right thing to say. Natalie drove back to Cincinnati when she was certain I was stable and called every evening while I was in the hospital. She had already researched cardiac rehabilitation programs in Chicago and forwarded me 3 articles about post-viral myocarditis recovery before I was discharged. This was so entirely Natalie that I laughed for the first time in days. Coming home from the hospital, meeting my father's house for the remaining 2 days of my recovery before I was cleared to drive back to Chicago, was strange. The house was the same house it had always been. Linda moved through it with a carefully maintained normalcy that neither addressed nor acknowledged what had happened. She made meals and kept the routines and spoke to me with a kind of formal politeness, the civility of someone who knows they have been indicted and has chosen to neither plead nor contest. My father was different. Not transformed, not suddenly the parent I had needed and not had, but different in small concrete ways. He asked how I was feeling in the morning and waited for the actual answer. He brought me tea without being asked. When I mentioned that the walk to the kitchen had tired me more than expected, he did not tell me I was pushing myself or suggest I needed to build endurance. He said, "That is okay. Sit down, I will bring things to you." These were small things. They were not restitution for 30 years. But they were real, and I accepted them as real, without minimizing them and without requiring them to carry more weight than they could hold. The day I left for Chicago, my father stood at the end of the driveway while I loaded my car. He helped with the bags. When everything was loaded, he stood with his hands in his pockets looking at me with an expression that had something unresolved and honest in it. He said he had been thinking about something the cardiologist had told him in the hallway that night, that the reason myocarditis was dangerous was not the initial inflammation, but the way continued exertion worsened it, that the body was asking for rest, and when that signal was overridden, the damage compounded. He said Dr. Asay had looked at him in a particular way when he said that, and he thought he understood what the look meant. I waited. He said he thought he had been teaching me to override signals my whole life, and he had not understood what he was compounding. I told him that I had needed to hear that for a long time. He nodded. He looked down at the driveway. He said he did not know how to undo it, but he wanted to try to do something different going forward if I was willing to let him try. I told him I would think about it. I told him that was the honest answer and I was done giving dishonest ones. He said that was fair. He said he was glad I was alive. He said it plainly, without decoration, in the voice of a man who had sat in a hospital waiting room and held the specific weight of an alternative outcome. I drove back to Chicago on a Tuesday morning in late June with the windows down and the music up and the strange, clarified feeling of a person who has been through something they cannot fully process yet, but knows they have come out of it changed. The chest pressure was largely gone. The cardiologist expected full recovery within 3 to 4 months with appropriate rest and monitoring. I had a follow-up appointment scheduled, and for the first time in my life, I was not talking myself out of going to it. Natalie was waiting at my apartment with groceries and very specific instructions about what I was and was not allowed to do for the next 2 weeks. I sat on my couch while she organized things in my kitchen and felt something I recognized slowly as the particular quality of being in a safe place. Not just the apartment, but the relationship. The context of being with someone who had never once required me to perform health. I did not have. 3 months later, cleared by my cardiologist and back to something like full strength, I was at a pharmacy picking up a prescription refill when I noticed a young woman standing at the counter looking pale and slightly unsteady. She was talking quietly to the pharmacist about chest tightness she had been having for several days. She said she was sure it was probably just anxiety. She said her mom thought she was overthinking it. The pharmacist was already reaching for the telephone to call the on-duty nurse. I still remember the casual shrug, as she handed me $200 and 1 minute love. For reassurance that she was not making too big a deal of things, she found me instead. I told her that it was good she had said something. I told her that knowing your body's signals and taking them seriously was not dramatic or excessive. It was exactly what she was supposed to do. She looked at me with the particular relief of someone who has been quietly afraid of looking foolish. Trust yourself, I told her. Your body is trying to tell you something. Listen to it. Walking home afterward in early September air, I thought about how long it had taken me to be able to say that to someone else without the private asterisk of doubt I had carried my entire life. The doubt was quieter now. Not gone because 30 years of conditioning does not dissolve in a season, but quieter. And in the space where the loudest doubt had been, something steadier had moved in. The knowledge earned at cost that my experiences were real, that my pain was legitimate, that my voice had always deserved to be heard, and that going forward I intended to use it. Have you ever been dismissed by someone who should have believed you? Have you ever had to fight to be taken seriously about your own body, your own pain, your own experience? Leave your story in the comments below. You are not alone, and your story matters. And if this resonated with you, please hit like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. I will see you in the next one.